The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty street of Independence, Missouri, as Lillian Zeller clutched her small satchel tighter, the certificate of marriage nearly burning a hole through the worn leather. Her hand instinctively moved to the right side of her face, fingertips grazing the puckered scars that ran from temple to chin, a permanent reminder of the fire that had claimed her family's homestead and everyone she loved 3 years ago. The year was 1873, and Independence had transformed from the bustling jumping-off point for westward travelers to a town struggling to maintain relevance as the railroads pushed further into the frontier. For a woman alone, with no family and a face that caused children to stare and adults to avert their eyes, options were limited. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed her last hope, even if the Missouri farmer who'd sent for her would surely send her away once he saw her disfigurement. "Miss Zeller," the station master approached, his eyes darting everywhere but her scarred cheek. "Your, intended sent word, he's not coming." The words struck Lillian like a physical blow. "I see," she managed, though her throat constricted painfully. "Did he say why?" A foolish question. She knew why. Said he'd heard about your. The man gestured vaguely toward her face, situation. Reckoned he didn't sign up for damaged goods. Tears threatened, but Lillian refused to let them fall. 3 years of cruel stares had hardened her against public displays of weakness. "Thank you for telling me," she said stiffly, turning away to hide the trembling of her lips. The station master cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There's a bride auction at Mason's Saloon tonight, for women with limited options. Might fetch enough for a ticket back east." A bride auction. The very bottom of a desperate woman's options in the West. Lillian's stomach turned, but her purse contained exactly 47 cents, not enough for a meal, let alone lodging or passage anywhere else. "Thank you," she whispered, though gratitude was the furthest thing from what she felt. Mason's Saloon reeked of whiskey, sweat, and desperation. The auction was already underway when Lillian slipped through the batwing doors. 5 other women lined up on a makeshift stage. Most were clearly destitute, some possibly former prostitutes too old for their former profession, others immigrants who'd found their American dreams shattered by reality. $10 for the blonde, called the auctioneer, a greasy-haired man with tobacco-stained teeth. "Who'll give me 15? Lillian nearly turned and fled, but hunger and homelessness proved more compelling motivators than dignity. She approached the side of the stage, where a thin woman with hard eyes directed her to wait her turn. "Keep your face turned right until you're up there," the woman advised in a flat voice. "Might get a better price that way." One by one, the women were auctioned off. $20, 15, 12 for an older woman with a persistent cough. When Lillian's turn came, she stepped onto the stage with as much dignity as she could muster, keeping her scarred side angled away from the crowd as instructed. "Next up, gentlemen, fresh off the eastbound train. Young, healthy, can probably cook and clean. Who'll start the bidding at $10? The saloon fell silent as Lillian fully faced the crowd, the lamplight cruelly highlighting her scars. "Jesus," someone muttered. $5. The auctioneer tried, his voice losing its enthusiasm. Silence. $3. Surely she's worth $3 to someone. The humiliation burned worse than the fire that had marked her. Lillian stared at the floorboards, wishing they would open and swallow her whole. $3. The voice came from the back of the room, deep, steady, and somehow different from the drunken calls that had punctuated the earlier sales. A path cleared as a tall figure moved forward. Lucas Erickson stood 6'3" in his worn boots, trail dust still clinging to his denim and leather. His face was tanned and weathered from years under the open sky, with eyes the color of a summer storm. Unlike the others, he didn't stare at Lillian's scars with disgust or morbid fascination. He simply looked at all of her with a gaze so direct it made her want to hide and stand taller at the same time. Sold, to the cowboy for $3. The auctioneer seemed relieved to be rid of her, even at such a paltry sum. Lucas paid the money without comment, then approached the stage, offering a calloused hand to help Lillian down. His touch was unexpectedly gentle for hands so rough. "You have belongings?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Just this," Lillian replied, indicating her small satchel, trying to keep her voice from trembling. What kind of man purchased a bride for $3? What would he expect of her? She'd heard stories of women treated worse than cattle by the men who bought them. He nodded once, then gestured toward the door. "My horse is outside." The night air was cool on Lillian's burning face as they stepped onto the boardwalk. Lucas led her to a magnificent chestnut gelding tied at the hitching post, its coat gleaming even in the dim light from the saloon windows. "You'll ride," he said, not a question but not quite an order either. "Where are we going?" Lillian dared to ask as he lifted her effortlessly onto the saddle. Lucas secured her satchel behind the saddle before mounting behind her, his arms creating a secure cage around her as he took the reins. "My place. About an hour's ride." They rode in silence through the sleeping town and out onto the open prairie beyond. The moon had risen, casting silver light over the gently rolling landscape. Lillian sat rigid in the saddle, painfully aware of the stranger at her back, the heat of him seeping through her thin dress, the clean scent of soap beneath the trail dust. What had she done? Traded one desperate situation for another, but this one far from any help if things went badly. Yet something about Lucas Erickson's quiet dignity gave her hope, foolish perhaps, but hope nonetheless. The place turned out to be a modest but well-maintained cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, with a small barn nearby. A creek burbled somewhere in the darkness, and night birds called softly. Lucas dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. His hands at her waist were respectful, not lingering a moment longer than necessary. "I need to tend to Thunder," he said, nodding toward the horse. "The cabin's unlocked. There's food if you're hungry." Lillian hesitated. "Mr. Erickson, Lucas." "Lucas, then." "I." She faltered, uncertain how to articulate her fears without offending the man who now legally had every right to her. Something in his eyes softened. "Go on inside, Miss Zeller. Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." The cabin was simple but surprisingly comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, wooden table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the hearth. A curtained doorway presumably led to a bedroom. Everything was tidy, though definitely a man's living space, with few decorative touches. Lillian found bread, cheese, and apples in a small pantry and ate sparingly despite her hunger. When Lucas hadn't returned after an hour, she cautiously explored further, finding the bedroom contained a single large bed, neatly made. Her heart raced as she considered what was expected of her. They were, in the eyes of the law and society, married now or would be once they registered with the county clerk. The sound of the front door opening startled her back to the main room, where Lucas was hanging his hat on a peg. "I've made up a pallet for myself in the barn," he said without preamble. "You'll have the cabin to yourself tonight." Lillian stared at him in confusion. "But we're strangers," he cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't share my bed with strangers, no matter what papers might say." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a strange pang of disappointment that she quickly suppressed. "Thank you," she said softly. Lucas nodded, then moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the banked coals. There's a wash basin in the bedroom, and I left clean towels. He straightened, studying her for a long moment. Miss Zeller, Lillian, she corrected. If they were to be husband and wife, even in name only, formalities seemed pointless. Lillian. The way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. He took a step closer, then another, until he stood directly before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. To her surprise, he reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements as if approaching a skittish colt, and gently turned her face so that her scarred side was fully visible in the firelight. His expression remained unchanged as he studied the damaged tissue. "May I ask how it happened?" His tone carried no disgust, only genuine interest. "Fire," Lillian answered, resisting the urge to turn away. "Our farm in Pennsylvania, 3 years ago." Lucas nodded, then did something that stole her breath entirely. He leaned forward and, with infinite gentleness, pressed his lips to the worst of the scarring, just below her cheekbone. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he whispered against her skin, "because you survived." Something broke inside Lillian, then a dam holding back 3 years of grief, shame, and loneliness. Tears spilled down both cheeks as she wept openly for the first time since the fire, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. Lucas didn't try to shush her or pull away. He simply stood there, one hand lightly resting on her shoulder, bearing witness to her pain with a quiet strength that somehow made it easier to bear. When her tears finally subsided, Lillian wiped her face with trembling hands. "I'm sorry, don't be," he interrupted softly. "Some hurts need weeping." He stepped back then, reclaiming the respectful distance between them. "Get some sleep, Lillian. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure things out." With that, he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving Lillian to wonder what kind of man paid $3 for a scarred bride, only to treat her with more dignity than she'd known in years. Morning came with the crow of a distant rooster and pale sunlight filtering through the cabin's small windows. For a moment, Lillian lay disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, memories of the previous day rushing back like a flood. The failed meeting with her intended, the humiliating auction, the quiet cowboy who'd paid $3 for her. She rose quickly, splashed water on her face, and smoothed her rumpled dress as best she could. If she was to be Lucas Erickson's wife, whatever that might entail, she would face it with whatever dignity she could muster. The main room was empty, but a fire crackled in the hearth and a pot of coffee simmered on the cast-iron stove. Lillian poured herself a cup, savoring the rich aroma. Through the window, she could see Lucas in the distance, mending a section of fence. His movements were efficient and practiced, his broad shoulders flexing beneath his cotton shirt as he worked. The domesticity of the moment struck her with unexpected force. How long had she dreamed of a simple life like this? A home, however modest, and perhaps a partner who wouldn't flinch at the sight of her face. She was setting bread dough to rise when Lucas returned, stamping dust from his boots before entering. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident at finding her at work in his kitchen. "You didn't need to do that," he said, nodding toward the dough. "I want to earn my keep," Lillian replied, wiping flour from her hands. Lucas's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're not a servant, Lillian. Then what am I?" The question escaped before she could reconsider its boldness. "What is this arrangement exactly?" He crossed to the wash basin, rolling up his sleeves to scrub the dirt from his hands and forearms. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken questions. "I need a wife," he finally said, drying his hands on a towel. "The legal kind, documented by the county clerk." Lillian's stomach nodded. "Why?" Lucas leaned against the counter, arms folded across his chest. I homesteaded this land 5 years ago. Been improving it, meeting all the government requirements. But there's a fella from St. Louis, Harrington, who's got connections with the land office. He's trying to invalidate claims all through this area, then buy the land cheap for the railroad. And being married helps your claim. Lillian ventured. Lucas nodded. Married homesteaders get preference, harder to challenge their claims. He met her eyes directly. I'm offering you a business arrangement, Lillian. A legal marriage, a roof over your head, food on your table, and my protection. In return, you help with the place, make it look like a proper family home when the land commissioner visits next month. And other marital duties, Lillian forced herself to ask, heat rising in her cheeks. His gaze never wavered. No, nothing you don't freely choose. Relief and strangely disappointment warred within her. Why me? Surely there were other women in that auction, women without. She gestured vaguely toward her scarred face. Something flickered in Lucas's eyes, a shadow of some old pain. I know what it's like to be judged for scars others can see. He turned slightly, pulling his shirt aside to reveal a mass of puckered tissue covering his left shoulder and disappearing down his back. Apache arrow, 7 years ago, got infected, nearly killed me. Lillian's hand moved of its own accord, reaching out before she caught herself. Lucas noticed, and after a moment's hesitation, inclined his head in permission. Her fingertips traced the edge of the scarring, feeling the difference in texture, the story of suffering written in his flesh. We all carry marks, Lucas said quietly. Some are just more visible than others. Lillian withdrew her hand, a new understanding forming between them. How long would this marriage last? A year minimum to satisfy the homestead requirements. His expression was unreadable. After that, if you want to leave, I'll pay for your passage wherever you want to go. Give you enough to start fresh. It was more generosity than Lillian had encountered in years. A safe place for at least a year. A chance to save something for her future. And a man who looked at her scars without flinching. I accept, she said simply. Lucas nodded once, as if sealing a business deal. We'll ride into town tomorrow, make it official with the county clerk. He hesitated, then added, I told folks I had a mail-order bride coming. Simpler than explaining the auction. Of course, Lillian agreed quickly, grateful for this small preservation of her dignity. There's one more thing. Lucas crossed to a cabinet, retrieving something from a drawer. When he returned, he held a small wooden box. This was my mother's. If we're to play the part of newlyweds convincingly. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, nothing fancy but solid and well-crafted. It's beautiful, Lillian murmured as he slipped it onto her finger. It was slightly loose but not enough to fall off. We can have it sized properly in town, Lucas said, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles before he released her hand. The weight of the ring was unfamiliar but not unwelcome. A symbol of their agreement, nothing more, Lillian reminded herself, even as something warm unfurled in her chest at the sight of it on her finger. The next morning they rode into Independence together, Lucas on Thunder, and Lillian on a gentle mare named Willow. The ride was pleasant, with Lucas pointing out landmarks and boundaries of his property. 160 acres, the standard homestead allotment, with good water access and fertile soil. You've done well with it, Lillian observed, noting the orderly fields and healthy livestock. Lucas shrugged. It's a start. Another few years I can add more cattle, maybe build a bigger house. The future in his voice caught Lillian's attention. He spoke as a man with plans, roots, a vision beyond immediate survival. So different from the drifters and fortune-seekers who populated much of the frontier. Independence was bustling with midweek activity when they arrived. Lucas helped Lillian dismount outside the county clerk's office. his hands firm and respectful at her waist. She smoothed her dress, her one good dress, now somewhat travel-worn, and adjusted her bonnet to partially shield her scarred cheek. Lucas noticed the gesture. "You don't need to hide," he said quietly. Lillian gave him a wan smile. "People stare. It's easier this way." Something like anger flashed in his eyes, quickly controlled. "Their problem, not yours." Nevertheless, he positioned himself on her right side as they entered the building, his broad shoulder a buffer between her scars and the curious gazes of strangers. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, barely glanced at Lillian's face, too busy shuffling through papers. "Marriage license and homestead documentation," he asked, examining the papers Lucas presented. "Everything seems in order. Need witnesses for the ceremony." "I've arranged for that," Lucas said, surprising Lillian. He hadn't mentioned any friends in town. The door opened behind them, admitting an older couple. The woman, plump and gray-haired, beamed at them. "Right on time, Lucas," she exclaimed, bustling forward to embrace him. "And this must be your bride." She turned to Lillian without a hint of reaction to her scars. "I'm Martha Whitley, dear, and this is my husband George. We run the general store. Lucas has been keeping us in suspense about you." "Lillian Zeller," she introduced herself, touched by the woman's warmth. "It's lovely to meet you." "Soon to be Lillian Erickson," Martha corrected with a wink. "Lucas has been our best customer for years. Never thought he'd settle down, but here you are. And lovely too, just as he said." Lucas had described her as lovely. "When?" Lillian shot him a questioning glance, but he was already moving toward the desk where the clerk had prepared the marriage certificate. The ceremony itself was brief and perfunctory, a civil proceeding with none of the religious trappings Lillian had once dreamed of. Lucas's "I do" was clear and steady. Lillian's own voice trembled slightly but gained strength when Lucas squeezed her hand gently, his calloused palm warm against hers. "You may kiss your bride," the clerk intoned, barely looking up from his paperwork. Lillian froze. They hadn't discussed this. Would Lucas expect her to turn her unscarred side toward him? Would he keep the kiss brief, a mere formality? Lucas solved the dilemma by gently turning her face so that her scarred cheek was proudly displayed to the room. Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that, while chaste, lingered just long enough to send warmth spreading through Lillian's body. "Congratulations, Mrs. Erickson," he murmured against her lips before drawing away, his eyes holding hers with unexpected intensity. Martha dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "So beautiful. Now you simply must join us for lunch at the hotel before you head back to the homestead." Before Lillian could respond, Lucas placed a protective hand at the small of her back. "We'd be delighted," he answered for them both. The Independence Hotel dining room was the finest establishment Lillian had been in since leaving Pennsylvania. White tablecloths, gleaming silverware, and servers in crisp uniforms created an atmosphere of civilization that seemed at odds with the frontier town outside. Martha chattered happily throughout the meal, filling in details about independence that Lillian would never have thought to ask. George spoke less but watched with kind eyes as Lillian navigated the social niceties of their first public appearance as a married couple. "How did you two meet?" Martha asked between bites of roast chicken. Lucas was so mysterious about his bride-to-be, Lillian tensed, unsure what story Lucas had concocted, but he answered smoothly. "Letter correspondence. My advertisement was in a Philadelphia newspaper. We wrote for 6 months before Lillian agreed to come west." He smiled at her with such convincing affection that Lillian felt her cheeks warm. Her letters showed her character, her kindness, her resilience. "How romantic," Martha sighed. "And now here you are starting your life together." Indeed, Lucas agreed, his hand finding Lillian's under the table and squeezing gently. The tenderness in the gesture, even knowing it was for show, made Lillian's heart flutter traitorously. After lunch, Lucas suggested they visit the general store for supplies. As they walked down the boardwalk, several passers-by nodded greetings, some openly curious about the new Mrs. Erickson. Lillian felt the familiar sensation of eyes lingering on her scars, but with Lucas's hand steady at the small of her back, it bothered her less than usual. At the store, Lucas consulted a list while the Whitleys helped gather items: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, nails and wire for fencing repairs, thread and needles. "Pick out some fabric," Lucas told Lillian, nodding toward a display of colorful bolts. "For curtains or dresses, whatever you need." "I couldn't," Lillian began, mindful of the $3 price he'd paid for her. "You can," he interrupted gently. "Choose what you like." While Martha helped her select several lengths of practical but pretty fabric, Lillian overheard George speaking to Lucas near the counter. "Harrington was asking about you yesterday," the older man said in a low voice. "Wanted to know if rumors of your marriage were true." Lucas's reply was too quiet to catch, but his posture had stiffened. When he rejoined Lillian, a new tension radiated from him. "Everything all right?" she asked as they loaded their purchases into saddlebags. "Fine," Lucas answered, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Let's head home before the afternoon heat builds." They were nearly to the edge of town when a sleek black carriage pulled by matched bay horses cut across their path, forcing them to rein in sharply. The carriage door opened, and a man stepped out expensively dressed, with a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest and a walking stick topped with a silver handle. "Erickson," he greeted, his smile showing too many teeth. "Thought that was you." His gaze slid to Lillian, lingering with calculated rudeness on her scarred cheek before dismissing her entirely. "Heard you've married. Congratulations." "Harrington," Lucas acknowledged, his voice carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you in Independence again so soon." "Business brings me to these charming frontier settlements regularly." Harrington twirled his walking stick. "I've acquired several properties in the area recently, good investments for the coming railroad." "Properties that were legally homesteaded," Lucas said evenly. Harrington's smile never wavered. "Legal is such a technical term. Paperwork gets lost. Improvements prove inadequate. Claims get invalidated." He glanced at Lillian again. "Though I hear marriage improves one's standing considerably. Clever strategy." Lucas's hand tightened on his reins until his knuckles whitened. "My wife and I need to be getting home." Of course. Harrington stepped back toward his carriage. "I'll be seeing the land commissioner next week in St. Louis. I'm sure your claim will come up in conversation." He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Erickson, charmed to make your acquaintance." The mockery in his tone made Lillian's stomach tighten, but she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly, refusing to be cowed by his obvious disdain. They rode in silence until Independence disappeared behind them, the tension in Lucas's shoulders gradually easing as the open prairie spread before them. "That was Harrington?" Lillian finally asked. Lucas nodded grimly. "Maxwell Harrington, railroad investor and land speculator. He's challenged 17 homestead claims in this county alone, won 14 of them. And he wants your land. He wants all the land along the projected railroad route. Mine happens to be particularly valuable because of the creek and the natural pass through those hills to the west." Lucas glanced at her. "I'm sorry you had to meet him. He's not known for his manners." "I've encountered worse," Lillian said with a shrug. "He looked at my face and thought he knew everything about me. Men like that always underestimate women they consider flawed." Lucas reined in suddenly, turning in his saddle to face her fully. "There is nothing flawed about you, Lillian Erickson," he said, his voice low and intense. "Nothing." The fervor in his words caught her off guard. "You don't have to say that, it's just us now. No audience to convince." "I'm not saying it for an audience." His gaze held hers. "I'm saying it because it's true." Something shifted between them in that moment, something Lillian couldn't name, but felt in the suddenly rapid beating of her heart. Lucas seemed to feel it too, for he cleared his throat and urged Thunder forward again. The conversation closed but not forgotten. As the homestead came into view, golden in the late afternoon sunlight, Lillian found herself studying it with new eyes. Not just a refuge or a temporary arrangement, but a home. Their home, at least for now. The thought brought an unexpected comfort. "Welcome home, Mrs. Erickson," Lucas said softly as they approached the cabin. And despite all the pretense and practicality of their arrangement, in that moment, it felt surprisingly, dangerously real. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and strangely familiar to Lillian. She rose early with Lucas, preparing breakfast while he tended to the livestock. They worked separately through the morning, Lucas in the fields or mending fences, Lillian cleaning, cooking, and gradually transforming the Spartan cabin into something more homelike. The new curtains she sewed from her store-bought fabric brightened the windows. She arranged wildflowers in a tin can on the table. Small touches that made the cabin feel lived in, as if a married couple truly shared the space. They took lunch together, sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes sharing stories, careful ones that revealed little of their deeper pains. Lucas spoke of his years driving cattle north from Texas, of storms weathered and rivers crossed. Lillian described her childhood in Pennsylvania, her mother's garden, her father's carpentry workshop. Neither spoke of how their lives had shattered Lucas from whatever had driven him to the solitary existence of a homesteader. Lillian from the fire that had claimed her family and marked her forever. These wounds remained private, though acknowledged in the quiet understanding that passed between them. In the evenings, they sat on the porch if weather permitted, watching the sunset paint the prairie in golds and purples. Lucas carved wood with a small knife, creating delicate figures of animals and birds. Lillian mended clothing or worked on a quilt pieced from scraps she'd found in a trunk. They slept separately, still Lillian in the bedroom, Lucas on a pallet in the main room that he insisted was comfortable enough. The arrangement preserved her dignity while highlighting the tenuous nature of their marriage. Business partners, Lucas had called them, a contract of convenience. Yet there were moments that tested the boundaries of this understanding. When Lucas's hand brushed hers as he passed a cup of coffee. When she caught him watching her as she hung laundry on the line, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met across the dinner table, and something electric passed between them before one or both looked away, on the surface, they enacted the roles of husband and wife with increasing comfort. Beneath, currents of something more complex swirled, unacknowledged but undeniably present. A week after their wedding, Lillian ventured to ask about the land commissioner's upcoming visit. "When should we expect him?" she inquired as they washed dishes together after supper. Lucas handed her a plate to dry. 2 weeks from Thursday, if the letter's timing is correct. He'll inspect the property, verify improvements, check that we're actually living here as claimed. And our marriage strengthens your position, significantly. Lucas's hand stilled in the soapy water. The government favors families putting down roots. A bachelor might pick up and move on. A married couple represents stability, community building. Lillian nodded, understanding the logic while wondering at the artifice of it all. Their marriage certificate was genuine, but the relationship it supposedly represented was theater convincing theater, perhaps, but performance nonetheless. "I'll make sure everything is perfect," she promised, setting down the dried plate. "He'll have no reason to doubt we're a proper family." Lucas looked at her then, something softening in his eyes. "You've already made a difference here, Lillian. The cabin has never looked so much like a home." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. "I've enjoyed it," she admitted. "Creating a home again, I mean. Even if it's temporary." Lucas opened his mouth as if to say something more, then closed it, returning his attention to the dishes. The moment passed, but Lillian felt its weight linger between them. The following Sunday, Lucas surprised her by suggesting they attend church services in Independence. "People are curious," he explained as they readied for the ride. "A reclusive bachelor suddenly married. Better to introduce you properly, let folks see us together." "You're worried about Harrington spreading rumors," Lillian guessed, pinning her hair into a neat bun. Lucas nodded, looking unusually formal in a clean shirt and string tie. "He'll try to discredit the marriage any way he can. If the community accepts us as a legitimate couple, it strengthens our position." Lillian smoothed her dress, the green calico she'd sewn from the store-bought fabric, her first new garment in years. "I'm ready," she said, though her stomach knotted at the prospect of facing an entire congregation's scrutiny. The little white church was filled to capacity when they arrived. Heads turned as Lucas guided Lillian down the aisle, his hand steady at her elbow. Whispers followed them like ripples in a pond. Lillian kept her head high, though she felt the familiar weight of stares on her scarred cheek. To her surprise, Lucas chose seats near the front, not hiding her away in a shadowed corner. As they settled into the pew, he draped his arm casually along the back, his fingers just brushing her shoulder in a gesture both protective and possessive. Martha Whitley bustled over before the service began, beaming with approval. "Lillian, dear, how lovely to see you both." She lowered her voice to a stage whisper. "Everyone's simply dying to meet Lucas's bride. You must join us for the social after services." Before Lillian could formulate a graceful refusal, Lucas answered for them. "We'd be delighted, Martha, thank you." The service itself offered a welcome respite from social anxiety. The familiar rhythms of hymns and prayers transported Lillian back to happier times, when she'd sat between her parents in their little Pennsylvania church, whole and unblemished. She sang softly, aware of Lucas's rich baritone beside her, their voices blending in surprising harmony. During the sermon, his hand found hers, fingers interlacing with gentle pressure. A performance for onlookers, Lillian reminded herself, even as her pulse quickened at the contact. The social afterward proved less daunting than anticipated. Martha took charge, introducing Lillian to a bewildering array of Independence residents. Most showed only momentary surprise at her scars before polite conversation resumed. A few women, friends of Martha's, expressed genuine welcome and invited her to join their quilting circle. "Lucas has kept to himself too long," one older woman confided. "It's good he's found someone to share that lovely homestead." "You've put some color in his cheeks," another observed with a knowing smile. "Haven't seen him look so alive in years." Lillian glanced across the churchyard where Lucas stood talking with several men, his posture relaxed, a rare smile lighting his features as he responded to something one had said. He looked different here, more open, less guarded than on the homestead. She wondered suddenly how lonely his life had been before her arrival. As if sensing her gaze, Lucas looked up, their eyes meeting across the crowd. The smile he gave her, then warm, genuine, almost tender, sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with their practiced performance. On the ride home, Lucas seemed thoughtful, responding to her observations about the service with distracted nods. "Did I do all right?" Lillian finally asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "As your wife, I mean. Was I convincing?" Lucas glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You were perfect," he said quietly. "Too perfect." "What does that mean?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze returning to the trail ahead. "Nothing. Just that you've made this easier than I expected." The words should have pleased her, but something in his tone suggested complication rather than compliment. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the unspoken tension between them, a third presence on the journey home. That night, after Lucas had retreated to his pallet in the main room and Lillian lay alone in the bedroom, she found herself staring at the ceiling, turning their strange situation over in her mind. She had entered this arrangement expecting pragmatism, perhaps even hardship. She hadn't expected to find comfort in Lucas's quiet presence, hadn't expected to look forward to their shared meals and evening conversations, hadn't expected the small thrill that coursed through her when his eyes lingered on hers or his hand brushed against her skin. Dangerous territory, this blurring of boundaries between pretense and genuine feeling. In less than a year, their arrangement would end. Lucas would keep his land. Lillian would take whatever funds he provided and start anew elsewhere. Their paths would diverge as abruptly as they had converged. Practical, sensible. The arrangement they had agreed upon, so why did the thought now fill her with a hollowness she couldn't name? The days before the land commissioner's visit passed in a flurry of preparation. Lucas worked from dawn to dusk, ensuring every aspect of the homestead met or exceeded requirements. Fields cultivated, fences mended, livestock healthy. Every improvement documented meticulously. Lillian focused on the domestic sphere, cleaning until the cabin gleamed, baking bread and pies to fill the space with homey aromas. She planted flowers along the front path and hung the completed quilt on the bedroom wall. Small touches to reinforce the image of a settled, committed couple. The night before the commissioner's arrival, tension thrummed through the cabin. Lucas paced the main room, reviewing documents for the dozenth time. Lillian folded and refolded linens, arranging them in the trunk with unnecessary precision. What if he sees through us? She finally voiced the fear that had been growing within her. What if he can tell our marriage isn't real? Lucas paused his pacing, running a hand through his hair. He's looking at legal requirements, not feelings. We have the documentation. We live here together. That's what matters. But if Harrington has poisoned his mind against us, we'll handle it, Lucas interrupted, crossing to where she stood and taking her hands in his. Together. The simple touch steadied her. His thumbs traced small circles on her palms, the calluses on his skin a reminder of all he had built here, all he stood to lose. "Lucas," she said softly, "if tomorrow goes badly, it won't. But if it does," she persisted, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything. For treating me with dignity when others couldn't see past." She gestured vaguely toward her scarred cheek. Lucas's expression softened. One hand released hers to gently cup the damaged side of her face, his thumb tracing the ridge of scar tissue with a touch so tender it made her breath catch. "Your scars are part of you," he said, his voice low and intense. "They're not something to look past. They're proof of your courage, your survival." No one had ever spoken of her disfigurement that way, as something to honor rather than pity or revile. Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes, and she turned her face into his palm, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. Lucas stepped closer, the space between them suddenly charged with unspoken possibility. His gaze dropped to her lips, and Lillian felt herself swaying toward him, drawn by something more powerful than conscious thought. A knock at the door shattered the moment. They jerked apart like guilty adolescents. Lucas cleared his throat, straightening his shirt as he moved to answer. Lillian pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks, heart racing with the awareness of what had nearly happened. The visitor proved to be a messenger from town, bearing news that the land commissioner had arrived early and would be visiting their homestead first thing in the morning. Lucas tipped the boy and closed the door, turning back to find Lillian standing exactly where he'd left her, still struggling to compose herself. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice deliberately casual. "Big day tomorrow." Lillian nodded mutely and retreated to the bedroom, closing the curtain that served as a door with hands that trembled slightly. She leaned against the wall, eyes closed, forcing her breathing to steady. What had almost happened? What had she almost allowed to happen? The boundaries of their arrangement, clear, practical, sensible boundaries, had nearly dissolved in a moment of shared vulnerability. And if the messenger hadn't interrupted? Lillian pressed her fingers to her lips, imagining the pressure of Lucas's mouth against hers. Not the perfunctory kiss of their wedding ceremony, but something real, something true, something that would make their inevitable parting infinitely more painful. She changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the quilt, determined to banish such dangerous thoughts. Tomorrow was too important to risk complicating with confused emotions. They needed clear heads and convincing performances to secure Lucas's homestead. The rest, whatever it was or might have been, would have to wait. Commissioner Roderick Blake arrived precisely at 8 o'clock the following morning, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and the air of someone who took his governmental authority very seriously. Lucas met him at the edge of the property, while Lillian watched nervously from the porch, dressed in her best, hair neatly arranged. "Mrs. Erickson," Blake greeted her with a formal bow as Lucas walked him to the cabin. "A pleasure. I understand you're a recent addition to our frontier community." "Yes, sir," Lillian replied, smiling warmly as she'd practiced. "Though it already feels like home." Blake's eyes flickered briefly to her scarred cheek, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "Excellent, excellent. Nothing like a woman's touch to civilize the wilderness, Erickson?" "Indeed," Lucas agreed, his hand finding the small of Lillian's back in what had become a familiar, comforting gesture. "Shall we show you the improvements since your last visit, Commissioner?" For the next 2 hours, they led Blake through a carefully choreographed tour. Lucas detailed the agricultural accomplishments: acres cultivated, crops planted, irrigation systems improved. Lillian highlighted the domestic aspects: the vegetable garden she'd expanded, the chickens she tended, the preserved foods lining the pantry shelves. Throughout, they maintained the casual physical contact of a comfortable married couple, hands brushing, shoulders touching, small smiles exchanged. The performance came more naturally than Lillian had expected, requiring less conscious effort than genuine restraint. "You've accomplished a great deal, Erickson," Blake acknowledged as they returned to the cabin for the refreshments Lillian had prepared. "More than the minimum requirements, certainly." Hope flickered in Lucas's eyes. "Then you'll confirm my claim is valid." Blake settled his substantial frame into a chair at the table, accepting the coffee and apple pie Lillian served. "Well now, that's the question, isn't it? Your improvements are impressive, but there have been concerns raised." "By Harrington," Lucas stated flatly. Blake didn't deny it. "Mr. Harrington has questioned several aspects of your claim, including the legitimacy of your recent marriage." Lillian nearly dropped the coffee pot. "I beg your pardon. No offense intended, Mrs. Erickson." Blake dabbed at his mustache with a napkin. "But Mr. Harrington suggests your union was arranged solely to strengthen the homestead claim." A marriage of convenience, so to speak. That's absurd, Lucas said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Blake raised a placating hand. I'm merely relaying the concern. The timing is, you must admit, convenient. Lillian set down the coffee pot carefully, her mind racing. This was precisely what they had feared, their pretense questioned, their arrangement exposed as the practical business deal it was. Commissioner Blake, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. May I speak frankly? Blake nodded, curiosity evident in his expression. Lillian took a seat across from him, folding her hands on the table. Lucas and I corresponded for 6 months before I agreed to come west. During that time, I came to admire his character, his determination, his vision for this land. The lies came easily, woven with threads of truth she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. When I arrived in Independence, I was uncertain. She touched her scarred cheek briefly. This makes many men reconsider their interest, you see. But Lucas. She glanced at her husband, finding his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Lucas saw beyond it. He saw me. The emotion in her voice was real, she realized with a jolt. The gratitude, the admiration, the growing affection, all genuine, though buried beneath layers of practicality and self-protection. I may not be the beautiful bride some men dream of, she continued, returning her gaze to Blake, but I am a true partner to my husband. We are building something here together, not just to satisfy government requirements, but because we believe in this place and in each other. Silence followed her speech. Blake studied her thoughtfully, then turned to Lucas. Mr. Erickson, would you care to add anything? Lucas cleared his throat, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. Only that I'm the fortunate one, Commissioner. His voice roughened with emotion. Lillian could have chosen an easier life than that of a frontier wife. She chose me instead. I intend to be worthy of that choice. The raw sincerity in his words sent a tremor through Lillian's heart. Was this still performance? Or had something shifted, lines blurring between pretense and truth? Blake observed them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I believe I've seen enough to make my determination. He rose, gathering his hat and papers. I'll be filing my report tomorrow, but I can tell you now, Mr. Erickson, that I find your claim valid and your improvements more than satisfactory. Lucas's shoulders sagged with visible relief. Thank you, Commissioner. Don't thank me yet, Blake cautioned as they walked him to the door. Harrington is persistent and well-connected. He may appeal my decision. Let him try, Lucas said with quiet confidence. This is our home. We're not giving it up without a fight. Our home. The words lingered in Lillian's mind long after Blake had departed, long after Lucas had ridden out to check on a distant section of fencing, claiming a need to clear his head after the tension of the morning. Our home. Not his homestead where she temporarily resided. Our home. As if the future stretched before them, shared and certain, dangerous thoughts for a marriage with an expiration date. When Lucas returned late in the afternoon, something had changed in his demeanor. A new resolve hardened his features as he strode into the cabin, removing his hat and hanging it on its customary peg. We need to talk, he said without preamble. Lillian set aside the shirt she'd been mending, apprehension curling in her stomach. About the commissioner's visit, about us. Lucas remained standing as if too restless to sit. About what happens now. I thought the plan was clear, Lillian said carefully. We maintain the appearance of marriage until your claim is finalized, then I move on with your financial assistance. Lucas paced to the window, then back, agitation evident in every movement. Is that still what you want? The question caught her off guard. We agreed, I know what we agreed, he interrupted, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I'm asking what you want, Lillian. The directness of the question left her momentarily speechless. What did she want? The safe, predictable path they had planned, or something riskier, less defined, but potentially more fulfilling? I don't know, she admitted finally, the truth of it settling between them. When I came here, all I wanted was survival, safety, a chance to rebuild some kind of life. She met his gaze steadily. You've given me that, Lucas, more than that. He crossed to her then, crouching before her chair so they were eye to eye. What you said to Blake today. I meant it, Lillian whispered, unable to dissemble with him so close, his eyes searching hers for truth. Not all of it began as truth, but it's become true. You did see me, Lucas, not just my scars, but me. Something in his expression shifted, hope kindling where uncertainty had been. I haven't been entirely honest with you, Lillian, her heart stuttered. About what? About why I chose you that night at the auction. His hand rose to gently cup her scarred cheek, a touch that had become both familiar and breathtaking. It wasn't just about getting a legal wife for the homestead claim. I could have found someone else for that. Lillian held perfectly still, afraid to break the spell of this confession. Then why? Because the moment I saw you standing on that stage, head high despite everything, I recognized something in you that matched something in me. His thumb traced the ridge of her cheekbone. Survival, resilience, and underneath it all, a loneliness so deep it had become part of who you are. His voice roughened, who we both are. The truth of his words pierced her with sweet pain. Lucas, I don't want you to leave when the year is up, he said quietly, the confession seeming to cost him something vital. I want you to stay. Not as part of our arrangement, but because you choose to, because this is your home too. Tears blurred Lillian's vision. Are you asking me to remain your wife? Truly? Lucas's smile was tender, transforming his weathered face. I'm asking for much more than that, Lillian Erickson. I'm asking if you might someday love me as I've come to love you. The words struck her with the force of revelation, not because they were unexpected, but because they named the feeling that had been growing within her, unnamed but undeniable. Since the moment he had whispered against her scars that she was beautiful for having survived. I already do, she whispered, her hand covering his where it rested against her cheek. I think perhaps I have since that first night when you looked at me and truly saw me. The confession hung between them for a heartbeat, and then Lucas was drawing her to her feet, into his arms, his mouth finding hers with a gentleness that belied the intensity of his embrace. This was no performance for onlookers, no calculated gesture for appearances. This was real, achingly, wonderfully real. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. Stay with me, he murmured. Not for a year, but for a lifetime. Yes, Lillian answered, the single word carrying the weight of all her hopes, all her fears, all her dreams of a future she'd once thought forever denied her. Yes, I'll stay. The months that followed transformed the homestead as surely as they transformed the two souls who called it home. The land commissioner's favorable report was filed, and despite Harrington's blustering attempts to appeal, the claim stood firm. Lucas's status as a married homesteader, combined with his obvious improvements to the land, created an unassailable legal position. But the greater transformation occurred within the walls of the cabin, where pretense gave way to genuine partnership and blossoming love. Lucas moved his belongings into the bedroom, their nights now shared in tender intimacy. They worked side by side during the days, building not just a functioning farm but a true home. Word spread through Independence about the Erickson homestead, its prosperity, its promise, and the devoted couple at its heart. Visitors became more frequent as Lillian's natural warmth and Lucas's quiet steadfastness drew others to them. The Whitleys became regular Sunday guests, along with other neighbors who had initially kept their distance from the solitary bachelor Lucas had once been. Lillian joined the quilting circle and found, to her surprise, that her scars eventually ceased to be the first thing people noticed about her. In time, she became known instead for her garden, her cooking, her skill with needle and thread, for the way she could coax a smile from her once somber husband, and for the palpable happiness that radiated between them. One evening in early autumn, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, Lucas took Lillian's hand, his expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. "The future," he answered, his thumb absently tracing the gold band on her finger, the same ring he'd placed there for their marriage of convenience, now a symbol of something far more precious. "I was thinking we might build a bigger house come spring, more rooms." Lillian smiled, understanding the unspoken question. "For children, if you want them," he said cautiously, "if you're ready." She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "Lucas, there's something I need to tell you." A smile bloomed across her face, radiant with joy. "We may need that bigger house sooner than spring." Understanding dawned slowly in his eyes, followed by wonder. "Lillian, are you?" She nodded, happiness bubbling up like a spring. "The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, probably by late winter." Lucas stared at her in speechless amazement before gathering her into his arms with a whoop of joy that startled the chickens in the nearby coop. He held her as if she were made of the most precious china, his face buried in her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered against her temple, "for staying, for loving me, for giving me a family." Lillian closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of his embrace, the security of his love, the promise of their future together. "We gave each other a family," she corrected gently, "from the moment you paid those $3 at that awful auction." Lucas drew back slightly to look into her eyes, his expression turning serious. "I need to tell you something about that night," he said. "Something I've never told anyone." Lillian waited, curious at his sudden solemnity. "When I first saw you on that stage, I recognized something in your eyes. Not just courage or defiance, but a kind of recognition, as if your soul saw mine across that crowded room." He brushed a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "When they called for bids and no one spoke, I knew I had to. Not out of pity or even practicality, though I told myself that later." "Then why?" Lillian asked softly. "Because in that moment I knew you were meant to be mine and I yours." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I knew we were two halves of something broken that might, together, make something whole again." Tears filled Lillian's eyes at the simple poetry of his words. This man of few words, who expressed himself more through action than speech, had seen into the heart of what had happened between them with startling clarity. "That's why you whispered that I was beautiful for having survived," she realized. "You weren't just being kind. You were recognizing yourself in me." Lucas nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright in the fading light. "We both survived, Lillian, and now together we get to do more than just survive. We get to live." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, talking softly of the future they would build together, the house with more rooms, the children they would raise, the land that would sustain them through the seasons of their lives. Lillian thought of the frightened, scarred young woman who had stepped off the train in Independence, certain that her future held nothing but rejection and loneliness. How could she have known that in the depths of her humiliation, at an auction block in a frontier saloon, she would find not just shelter but love, not just a husband but a partner who would see her scars as badges of courage rather than marks of shame? "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, Noticing her contemplative silence, Lillian smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I was thinking that sometimes the things we believe are our greatest weaknesses become our greatest strengths. That sometimes our deepest wounds lead us to our deepest healing." Lucas pressed a kiss to her forehead, his arms tightening around her. "And sometimes," he added softly, "the journey that begins with $3 and desperate hearts ends with something so precious no fortune could purchase it." As night fell fully over their homestead, Lillian Erickson closed her eyes in contentment, secure in the knowledge that the scars that had once marked her as unwanted had led her to the place she was always meant to be, to the man she was always meant to love. The tears that Lucas's whispered words had once caused her to weep, tears of recognition, of being truly seen for perhaps the first time, had transformed into the quiet joy that now filled her days and nights. They were no longer two broken souls seeking shelter in a practical arrangement. They were husband and wife, soon to be father and mother, building a future on the foundation of a love that had begun in the most unlikely of places, but would sustain them for all the days of their lives. And in the years that followed, as their family grew and their homestead flourished, Lillian would sometimes touch her scarred cheek and remember the night when a quiet cowboy had paid $3 for a damaged bride, then whispered words that changed everything. Not because he had seen past her scars, but because he had seen them clearly as the map of a journey that had led her home. Their story became something of a legend in Independence, and beyond how Lucas Erickson had claimed both land and love with equal determination, how Lillian had transformed from an object of pity to a woman admired and respected throughout the county. Their children grew up strong and unafraid, taught by their parents' example that true beauty lay in resilience, that scars were simply proof that wounds could heal, and that love was worth any price. And on their 25th wedding anniversary, when their homestead had expanded into one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory, Lucas presented Lillian with a small wooden box. Inside lay 3 silver dollars, polished to a high shine. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled by the gift. Lucas's smile was tender as he took her hand, the same hand he had claimed that long-ago day in the county clerk's office. "The best investment I ever made," he said simply. "With interest." Lillian laughed through sudden tears, understanding the perfect symbolism of the gift. $3 once the price of desperation, now a testament to a lifetime of love that had multiplied beyond measure. She reached up to touch his face, weathered now with age and years of prairie sun, but still as dear to her as on that first night when he had seen her truly. "Best $3 ever spent," she whispered, and kissed him beneath the vast prairie sky that had witnessed their journey from strangers to soul mates, from a marriage of convenience to a union that would endure for all their days.